It's Sunday, and this is the Ryan Report. There's a major public health issue that we are now only beginning to talk about. Most of the deaths associated with this health issue can be prevented, and you are part of the solution. It's an important conversation, and we're going to start it right now.
From TV6, this is the Ryan Report. Here's your host, Don Ryan.
Over 40,000 people die by suicide each year in the United States. It's the country's 10th leading cause of death. Over 1,400 of those deaths occurred in Michigan, and many of those were here in the Upper Peninsula. Suicide is a complicated and tragic story, but it's often preventable. Learning how we can do that is the purpose of today's program. Our guests are two people who work with this matter every day. Bobby Ayatt is a health educator with the Luce-Mackinac-Alger Schoolcraft District Health Department, and Sarah Derwin fills that assignment with the Marquette County Health Department. Pleased they could both join us this morning. Sarah, Bobby, welcome to the Ryan Report.
Thank you. Thank you, Don.
Nice to have you with us. I'm hoping this morning we can provide some background and hopefully some helpful insights into this very difficult subject. But at the very outset, I think it's important to emphasize that for those who are watching us who are troubled, or those who have friends and family who are dealing with a difficult issue, there is help available and there's hope. Talk to us about that, Sarah.
So one really important thing when we're talking about suicide and where do you go for help or immediate help, one thing we really like to promote in our field is there is the crisis line, and it's connected to the National Lifeline, but we have our local Dial Help Crisis Center that covers the whole UP, and they can be accessed 24/7 year-round. They never close, and we have some benefits with our crisis center that not only can we call them, but you can text them or you can chat online with them, or if you live in the Houghton area, you can even walk in. So these are trained crisis specialists that you can talk to any time of the day or night. So it's a really important resource for people who are struggling, or if you're worried about somebody to call, they're just always there and always available.
I want to explore some of the background because, this is a subject we typically haven't talked a lot about. And is it a good thing that we're talking more about it today?
It is. It's so important to talk about what are the resources, what are the warning signs, to have people be aware of that so that then they can see that in their own lives. Sometimes there can be the fear that if we talk about it, it might put the idea in folks' head, and we know over a lot of research that that doesn't tend to be true.
Are we seeing more suicides today, or are we just hearing more about it?
I think it could be a bit of a mix. With that awareness, we're hearing about it, and it's a lot more at the forefront, and we're comfortable to talk about it. Families maybe don't feel as much of the stigma that they can share their grief and share maybe the cause of death if they've lost somebody to suicide. So we're hearing about it more, but we do know on the national level that suicide has been on the rise. So we tend to mirror that national level too.
I think people, whenever they hear of a suicide, they'd like an answer. Why did this happen? But it's really a lot more complex than that, isn't it? There are no single answers.
There it is. If there's one take home that I talk about at a lot of my trainings is that suicide is complex. So usually we can't boil it down to just one reason or just one factor. And when people start to understand that, and especially, with the stigma and with grief, a lot of people can look to even blame. Who's at blame for this? Who's at fault for this? And what we try to do through a lot of our education efforts is just really get it across to people of how complex the whole issue is about suicide.
Okay. Let's look at some general facts. Are any age groups more susceptible than others?
As far as age groups, there are some groups that can be more at risk. We know that older, middle-aged adults, particularly men, can be at most at risk for completed suicide, and as they age, their risk increases. We know for young people, though, that suicide is in the top 3 causes of death for those younger categories. Particularly that age 10 to 24, they can be very at risk too.
Is that number increasing? Because we certainly have more focus on teenage suicide today.
Hard to tell. I think it could be, or our awareness of it could be too.
We hear a lot today about bullying, and especially among young people, and its impact. Is that in fact a factor in suicide?
Bullying could be a risk factor amongst others together, but one important thing we try to get across, especially to parents or other adults, is that bullying and suicide, they aren't always as intertwined as sometimes people will think. Most youth that get bullied do not consider suicide and won't die by suicide, so bullying doesn't, but we can look at it as a risk factor amongst a lot of other things that could be going on in a young person's life that could lead them to be at an increased risk for suicide.
And of course, as we talk about that, we weave the internet into it, and this also becomes a factor in bullying.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about, are there some risk factors that we've identified?
Yes, there are some pretty well-known risk factors, and if we can know these risk factors and we can educate the general public about these risk factors, it can just be things that could raise a red flag or for you to take into consideration if you're worried about someone. And one major thing that we talk about a lot is mood disorders, such as depression or anxiety. If somebody is suffering from these, and especially if they're undiagnosed or untreated, that could be a risk factor. And then there's also things like life events that happen that are going to test people's ability to cope. So a death, a divorce, somebody, if they had a big life change, like they financially, they lost their job or lost their house. Big life events like that can really sometimes send somebody into a spiral.
Okay, we'll pick up the discussion right there in just a couple of minutes. Back with more on the Ryan Report in just 2 minutes. Again, this morning, our guests are Sarah Derwin and Bobby Ayotte, both health educators. The subject is suicide. As we left the conversation, we were talking about the fact that depression can be a major factor in suicide.
Yes.
You know, I think, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, it seems like in some cases this happens after maybe a long experience, and other times it seems to be more instant. At least that's the perception that people may have. Is that the case?
You know, what we tend to say is people can be struggling for a while, but an actual suicidal crisis could be a short amount of time. It can be hours, days, or maybe a couple weeks. So what you can see is you could see somebody kind of moving along that has maybe some risk factors or have you know, some things, and they could have it for years. They could suffer from depression for years and years and kind of move along. But then what we'll tend to see is that there'll be something that will kind of propel them up into a crisis. So if they could kind of be going along with depression, but then something big happens or something small happens, but that will test their ability to cope. So yeah, you're definitely on that right line of, you know, that there are some underpinnings there.
As we watch some of the ads on television for various drugs, they talk about suicide being a possible side effect. Do you encounter a lot of that?
We don't see that quite as much as we do a lot of, you know, just the life events going on in someone's life and something happening to them or around them or, you know, kind of a combination of a lot of things.
You know, I think in most cases that those who have never considered suicide really can't get their arms around, you know, what are these people thinking? What leads to this? Can we give people some kind of insight into what's happening in the thought process of the person who's thinking about this?
It can be very hard to understand, and I always encourage people, you know, with talking about mood disorders or mental illness, to really try to talk with people that may suffer from that and get a better idea or a better scope of what can go on. And what we say is that when people are in a suicidal crisis, their thinking can be very narrow or very myopic, so very in that moment. So they're not thinking about maybe long-term consequences or the effect that their suicide or you know, them leaving would have on everyone. So it is, it's a different thought process during that time that might not be rational.
And those things you just mentioned, you know, the effect on others and the fact that it is the long-term consequence, but those thoughts are just not rational at that point.
Correct. And when you think about young people, they don't have that hardwire yet to even think about long-term consequences yet. So it can be, you know, another factor that their brains are still in development yet.
Okay. Let's talk about prevention. And Bobby, I know this is something you're both interested in, but this is something you work with every day. How do we begin the process? Where does it start?
So we've been working really hard with educating, and education for us has been key. Knowledge has been power, and we've kind of been going for those sayings for quite some time, but we've really been working on getting trainings and educations, collaborating with other organizations in our counties to get people educated. As of right now, just with a QPR training, which is an hour gatekeeper training, it's been free to all of our UP residents, but so far we in our counties have done over 600 people educating. So that's, you know, way more than we're normally educated. And this training that we do gives you the basic signs, the basic behaviors, and what to look for so we can try to reduce the suicides in our community.
Who are the people that are taking that training?
It's open to the community, and it can be anybody 12 years of age. And again, this training has been free, and it's going to continue to be free. But it's a great 1 hour training to help people know what to look for.
Okay, and does it also tell them what to do when they?
You know what it does?
encounter-
It helps them understand what questions to ask, what resources are available to the community, and some of them we actually tailor to that community. So if we know what resources are available, we'll give that information as well.
And I know you also spend considerable time working in schools.
I do,
And are
yes.
you finding schools very receptive for this?
They are. They really are. As of this year, what we're going to be trying to do is incorporate this QPR training into our life skills training, which we are already in the schools. And we talk about, in this life skills training, we do talk about coping with anxiety and coping with anger. And we do touch on depression and suicide. And it seems like these kids want to know more, and they want to know the resources. And a lot say they're going to go home and talk to their parents about this stuff too. So it's been really awesome. It's been great that the schools are accepting us doing this, because sometimes it can be a tricky subject, especially with kids.
What kind of reaction do you get from the students?
They want to know more. They ask questions. They wonder if suicide is how we're going to react to when they say the word, because it has been a stigma, and we're really trying to break that stigma. And if we can get the information to these kids at a young age, hopefully there won't be as many as there are, because we feel one in prevention is too many.
I know you also want to put emphasis on training the people who deal with young people.
Right, yep, and what we are doing right now is when we go into these life skills trainings that we do, we ask the kids, who would be your one person that you would talk to if you had any type of crisis emergency? And the two people that they mention are their best friends and coaches. Teachers are up there too, so we've been making sure that we want to train our teachers, we want to train our coaches, anybody that is around youth. And our newest ones have been pastors with churches, so we're getting them involved too as well.
Okay. We've got some more questions for you. We'll get back to those in just a couple of minutes. Back with more on the Ryan Report after we take this break. Again, our guests this morning are Bobby Ayotte and Sarah Derwin, both health educators, talking about suicide this morning. You're reaching kids in schools, you're reaching people in the community. Are you reaching enough people? Are you getting the message out to enough people?
You know what? I don't know that we ever will say we're getting it out to enough. One of the areas we are struggling with right now is parents. We understand their schedules are busy. We understand there's always something going on. But, when it comes to this topic, we're talking about saving lives. And, thinking about it as it's a 1 hour and it's valuable information. So if anybody ever has anything going on with parents, please let us know. We can get there. It's a 1 hour training. We bring everything. You just have to have the bodies there, and you will be more knowledgeable, I promise you, after that training.
I'm assuming you get out to service clubs and groups like that to get the message out?
We do, yep,
Okay.
we do.
What would you tell to someone watching our show today who may be having suicidal thoughts? What would the message be? What would you say to them?
I think I would try to emphasize the point that they're not alone, that there's somebody there that wants to listen, that can be there for them to help, that there's help available. So that would be a biggie.
And what's the message you would give to someone who is that friend or that person that's approached by someone who's considering suicide?
I would say you don't have to necessarily be a professional to reach out and help, to ask that question. I think sometimes we can be really afraid to ask a question as big as, are you feeling suicidal? Are you thinking of killing yourself? Because we're afraid of the answer, we're afraid we won't know what to do or where to refer them for help or anything. So I would try to empower that a gatekeeper can be anybody in our community that is just willing to say, I can try to help get you to that next step for assistance.
What do they do? What you know, where do they go with that information?
So if you're talking to somebody in a conversation and you ask, are you suicidal, and that person says yes, a good first step could be, depending on where you are, is to first, you would never leave that person alone, and all you want to do is be a link to assistance. So that link might be, let's call the helpline, and then that helpline could maybe assess a little bit further. If it's a young person, we might say, who is an adult in your life? Can we chat with your parents? I mean, sometimes it might be, do we need to take you, for emergency services? It could be that, but there's a big spectrum of help that you could at least be that initial link.
If you're really concerned, is law enforcement available to help? Is that an alternative?
We say if you feel that that danger is immediate, therefore if you're thinking that somebody maybe is drinking or taking drugs and is suicidal, they have a gun, they're somewhere, we would say the first number that you're going to be calling then at that point is 911 and get emergency services to them quick.
I think is it fair to say that suicide is probably among the most preventable of health issues?
Yes.
I don't know if we can call it disease, but
yeah,
I mean, it can be prevented.
It can be prevented, absolutely.
So there's really a message of hope here, I think. I really want to make sure we get that across to anybody who might be watching.
Yeah. There
Bobby, what other programs are you aware of that can help people in the community?
We collaborate again with an organization, and there are mental health first aid trainings. This is an 8-hour training, and we've been collaborating with Great Lakes Recovery in Negaunee. They offer that training. They actually have some coming up next week. I think there's one on October 31st in Negaunee, and there's also one specifically for law enforcement that they are offering. You can go to their website and they're on there. We also do an assist training where we collaborate with the Marquette County Health Department. This is a 2-day intensive emotional training on suicide prevention. I've taken this course. It's unbelievable, but you do learn a lot, and in this one you do role playing and you really feel in the moment and kind of can see if you can ask that question or what you need to do if you can't ask that question. You got to go find somebody that can, but that one's a great training as well. We also are doing the QPR trainings, as we already mentioned before, and if anybody watching is interested in these trainings, you can let us know. We have trainers that we know that are available, and we can get this training to you.
As far as contacting people, there are so many different people that can be contacted. I guess I'm going to suggest they go to the uppermichigansource.com, the TV6 website. On our homepage there is a spotlight tab, and then under that there is one on suicide prevention. So it lists a lot of different telephone numbers, places that can be contacted. We're just about out of time. I guess just a final thought from each of you. Sarah, what would be the final thought that you want to leave our audience with?
I think my final thought is just something that I feel like you've been really making sure that we discuss is that hope. It can be really hard talking about suicide, and it can feel like a very hopeless topic, but we have a lot of people working and are passionate about this issue. We have an active Marquette County Suicide Prevention Alliance that works on this issue all the time. So just getting that point across to people that there's hope, we can talk about it, and then hopefully we can save lives.
Okay, just any further thoughts, Bobby?
I'd say knowledge is power, and we need to get educated on suicide.
Okay. I want to thank both of you for coming in today. It's a very important subject, and it is a difficult subject, but hopefully we've left our audience with some important information. I'll be back with more on the Ryan Report in just a couple of minutes. Well, usually we wrap things up each week with something on the lighter side, but today that doesn't seem appropriate considering the nature of our discussion this morning. But related to that subject, this week the voters in the 109th District will be going to the polls to select a new state representative. The person they choose will be replacing State Representative John Keevala, who took his life earlier this year. I knew John Keevala. We served together on the Marquette City Commission, and as a state representative, he was always a welcome guest on this show. There are not words to adequately describe how I felt when I learned about his death and how it happened. It was a shock to me and to so many other people he knew, and even those he didn't know. And saying it was a shock doesn't truly describe how devastated I felt, and I know many others shared that feeling. Now, 6 months later, most of us who knew John still can't believe it happened, but it did. And that's why today's discussion was so important, not just because of John, but for him and for all the others who chose to end their lives, teenagers and young adults, people in the prime of life and those who are older. While there's increasing concern about the number of young people who have committed suicide, and we should be concerned, the truth is suicide is something that knows no age barriers or any other restrictions. The fact is all of our lives have been touched in some way by suicide. And although it's a difficult subject to discuss, it's vitally important that we do talk about it. It's important that we do our best to understand suicide, and it's especially important that those who are hurting, those who feel they can't cope with life, understand that they can talk about it. Talk about it to family or friends. Talk about it with those who can help. We need to move beyond the days of not talking about the subject. It's time it was taken out of the darkness and into the light. For those who are experiencing the problem, it is real and it is serious. But there's help and there's hope. We have to talk about it. We have to learn more about it. We have to listen. And we have to take action when the situation calls for it. There are health issues that are incurable. Suicide is not one of them. I'll be back in a minute. Before we wrap it up today, I do want to remind you that our weekly report is also available on the internet at uppermichigansource.com. This edition of the show will be available starting at about noon tomorrow if you'd like to watch it again or recommend it to others. I want to thank Bobby Ayotte and Sarah Derwin for joining us this morning. The topic of our discussion is as important as any we discuss, and I hope we've left you with an understanding that suicides can be prevented, and we're all part of that process. Thank you for watching. I hope you'll join us again next Sunday morning.